So first of all, thanks to Candice and Heidi and Brianna and everyone for the invitation today. Really happy to share this research with you. Um, I'm Jessica Kosie. I run the Communication and Learning Lab at Arizona State University, and I've been there for almost 2 years now. But a lot of the research I'm going to tell you about today was done in the Princeton Baby Lab in collaboration with Casey Lou Williams in my postdoc. And so the premise that guides all my research is that if we want to understand infant development, we need to study the everyday, natural, messy, and dynamic context in which this development actually occurs. And my motivation for this comes from observing and conducting these kind of typical lab studies, right? So this is a toy example, but it reflects a lot about a real lab study. So in a controlled experiment, the baby's in a very plain room, looking at a sparse image of a cat on a screen. Mom's there, but we remove her from the picture as much as we can, right? She's wearing noise-canceling headphones. She's asked not to interact with the baby. And the baby might hear something like, "Look at the cat," in really clear infant-directed speech. And so I wanted to contrast this with how an infant might encounter the word cat in the real world. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video for you. Hopefully, the sound works okay.
Cat enters the room. Hi, Wanda. Hi, Wanda. Mommy can Kobe cat. See the kitty? Kitty cat. Mommy can the cat.
Right, so there are multiple speakers and people around, right? There's children and adults. The infant's encountering the cat within a very cluttered environment. She's being moved around, laying down and sitting up. Sometimes the cat's referred to as a cat or a kitty cat, or even Wanda. And it's messy in multiple senses of the word. And this is very, very different from how we typically study learning in the lab. And we know that these differences are true. We control things in the lab for a very good reason. But in the 1970s, Uri Bronfenbrenner first discussed this as a problem of rigor versus reality, right? We have these beautifully designed, carefully controlled experiments that lead to conclusions like infants learn by doing X, but there's less focus on how these findings from controlled lab environments about what infants can do generalize to the natural environments in which infants are learning to what they do. Barbara Rogoff refers to this as a do-do hypothesis, which I like a lot. And the other thing we see, this is a video recording from one of my research studies. But another thing we notice when we get into natural environments and record from multiple families is that there's just a ton of variation, right? Both within a family from day to day and context to context, but also across families and communities and cultures. So there's really no one size fits all account to describe infants' learning environment. And I think that characterizing this variation is really crucial to understanding learning in a way that's generalizable across infants. And so today I'm going to tell you about a couple of the ways that I study this infant's natural environment. Obviously, there are many ways to do this, many people working on it. This is just some of what I've done. And so I'm interested in particular on communication between caregivers and infants. And so I'll tell you about how I've used experimenter-facilitated Zoom recordings to highlight the multimodal nature of caregiver-infant communication for infants in their own homes. I'll also talk about doing asynchronous Zoom recording to capture consistency and diversity in infant-directed communication from day to day and across activity contexts. And then finally, I'll describe some ways that I've used collaboration to try to expand the study of caregiver-infant communication across communities and cultures. Okay. So we know there's a lot of existing research about caregiver-infant communication. Caregivers use multiple cues in interactions with infants, and they modify these cues, like infant-directed speech, in ways that support learning. But this research often focuses on speech as a method of communication, or maybe one or two other cues, like speech and gesture. And so Casey and I wanted to get a sense of how caregivers use a full suite of 5 different communicative cues: speech, action, gesture, emotion-conveying facial expressions, and touch during everyday interactions with infants. So we recorded 44 dyads in their homes as they played. So in their own home, it was on Zoom. They interacted in their natural environment with their own toys. And these are what I'm calling experimenter-facilitated recordings. And what I mean here is that before they played, caregivers logged onto the Zoom call. The researcher met with them, helped them get set up, checked the camera angle, the lighting. And then the researcher told the family that I won't be watching. I'm going to turn off my camera and let the dyad play for 10 minutes. And then I had an amazing team of research assistants who hand-coded each of these videos moment by moment, so continuously, for caregivers' use of these 5 dimensions of communication: speech, actions on objects, gesture, emotion conveying facial expressions, and touch. And this is caregiver touching the infant. And so to give you an overall picture of what this looked like across all the dyads, the x-axis here is the proportion of the interaction during which each dimension occurred, and the y-axis are the different dimensions of communication. And so caregivers are speaking during about 60% of the interaction. That's that solid purple dot. But there's a lot of variability, right? Some caregivers are speaking 20% of the time, and others are speaking about 85% of the time. So a huge range there. The next most common is action, followed by gesture, emotion, and touch. And so we see variability across these dimensions. Some are used more than others, but we also see variability within each dimension, right? Some caregivers are using the dimension more than others. One thing that this plot doesn't take into account, though, is the temporal structure of events. And when we do that, we see that these events are actually occurring simultaneously. So in this plot, I'm going to show you each individual dyad on the x-axis. And then the y-axis is the proportion of speech that that infant heard that overlapped with at least one other dimension of communication. And so here's the data, and the dashed line's at 50%. And so we see that for almost all of the dyads, nearly half or more of the speech they hear occurs with other dimensions of communication. And so this really underscores the idea that we should be thinking about everyday caregiver-infant communication as a multimodal phenomenon and not just speech alone. But of course, this was just one day and one play session. And an everyday interaction during play might differ from an interaction during mealtime or book sharing. And these activity contexts don't just happen once, right? These are regular occurrences in the infant's daily life. They happen again and again. And so we might want to think about how stable or how different natural input is from day to day in addition to across activities. And there's quite a bit of existing evidence that caregiver speech does indeed differ across activity contexts, and that having predictable input like this is helpful for learning, which I think Tess will tell us about more in the next talk. But communication, as I showed you, is much more than speech. So we were interested in how additional opportunities for predictability might arise during these natural interactions. And so in a second study, we asked 46 caregivers to record themselves and their toddlers via Zoom as they engaged in 3 different activity contexts, playtime, mealtime, and book sharing, on 2 different days. And the method we used here is what I'm calling this asynchronous Zoom, where we sent families a Zoom link. As soon as they logged into the Zoom link, it started recording. There was no experimenter there. They just logged in themselves. We asked them to record at times when they might naturally be engaging in these activities. And we did give them some images of how they might set up for the recording, but they just did it themselves. They engaged in each activity for about 10 minutes. And then when they signed off, the video was automatically uploaded to our Baby Lab Zoom account. And then we pulled out the middle 5 minutes from each video and again coded them for these 5 dimensions: speech, action, gesture, emotion, and touch. But this time, instead of coding continuously, which we had found out was just incredibly time consuming, took a lot of time for my RAs, we did something a little different where we spliced each video into 5-second clips. And then our research assistants viewed each clip, and for each clip, they said whether or not these dimensions had occurred. So they watched a 5-second clip, and then they said, did speech occur? Yes or no? Did action occur? Yes or no? And so on. And so this is essentially the same plot I showed you before, but now for this new data set, averaged across days and contexts. And as before, we see there's a lot of speech, followed by action, gesture, emotion, and touch. So variation across dimensions. And we also see variation within each dimension across caregivers. One thing you might notice here is there's quite a bit more speech. In the previous plot, caregivers were speaking about 60% of the time. Now they're speaking about, 77% of the time. And this is likely due to the role of context. And so I'm not going to get to spend too much time on this slide, but this is how much caregivers are using these dimensions across days and across contexts. So day 1 on the top, day 2 on the bottom. Each individual plot or each individual kind of column, I guess, is as a different dimension of communication. The different contexts are on the x-axis, and the frequency of which each dimension is used is on the y-axis. And what you can see is that there's variability across contexts, especially for speech and action and gesture. But there seems to be some stability from day to day, right? And also from these individual plots, these individual dots, you can see that there's quite a lot of variability across caregivers. And so the next thing I did is I zoomed into the individual dyads. And so this is just one example dyad. The stacked bars here indicate how much of each dimension of communication was occurring. So if we compare these bars, we get a sense of how they're using speech, action, gesture, emotion, and touch from day to day and context to context. And so in this first dyad, for example, if you compare these two bars for play, they look pretty similar. Within mealtime, they look similar. Within book sharing, they look similar. But when you compare across contexts, like mealtime to book sharing, they look different. Here's another dyad, and you can see this kind of similar effect where within context, the bars look the same, but across context, they look more different. And across dyads, they look more different. And so I wanted to kind of test and quantify these observations. And so what I did is I calculated 4 different similarity indices where I used Euclidean distance, which can tell us how similar these communication patterns are from day to day, caregiver to caregiver, and context to context. And by pattern here, I mean the proportion of each of these dimensions of communication they're using. And so I compared IDC, or infant-directed communication, across 2 days, but for the same caregiver within the same context. I then compared within the same context, but across 2 different caregivers. And then I compared within the same caregiver, but now 2 different contexts. And then the last thing I did is the most different, right, was just 2 different caregivers in 2 different contexts, which we might expect to differ the most. And I did this for all possible combinations of each type. And so here on the x-axis is the different comparisons or similarity indices we're looking at. So same caregiver, same context, different caregiver, but same context. And then these 2 are the same caregiver, different context, and different caregiver, different context. The y-axis is a Euclidean distance, so lower values mean more similar or less distance between them. And so here's the data. The most similar, as we might expect, is when the same caregiver is engaging in the same activity from day to day. This next bar is for the different caregiver, but within the same context. So it shows one way that context shapes communicative input. And then the most different here are kind of both of these bars that indicate different contexts. So a different caregiver within a different context and the same caregiver within a different context. And so to quickly summarize this, we find that individual caregivers' use of IDC is similar when they're engaged in the same activity from day to day. Even across caregivers, engaging in the same activity leads to more similar patterns of communication. And this is perhaps due to the different affordances of the activity contexts. However, when caregivers are engaged in different activities, their use of multimodal communication, or IDC, really varies. And I think this really highlights this role of context in shaping communication, and specifically this predictability of multimodal communication. And so I mentioned earlier that this study extends from just 1 day and 1 activity to multiple days in multiple contexts, but this sample is still restricted, in this case, to families in Princeton, right? And I really want to take seriously variation across communities and cultures, and I've made efforts in this area, but progress here has been a little slower. But I'm going to tell you about some ways that I've attempted to expand diversity in my research, and a lot of this comes through collaboration. For example, to examine communication across bilingual families, we designed this Bilingual Families Project, which is an ongoing collaboration between the Princeton Baby Lab in New Jersey and the Concordia Infant Research Lab in Montreal. And this enables us to compare Spanish-English bilinguals in the US to French-English bilinguals in Canada. And in this project, we're interested in particular in language switching in natural input to bilingual learners, so switching between French and English or Spanish and English, and how this relates to skill in their 2 languages. So as a first step in characterizing language switching, we recruited families in New Jersey and Montreal. We recorded them using this, again, experimenter-facilitated Zoom method, where the experimenter was there and met with the family. But we recorded them on during 2 different sessions. So in session A, we had the infant and 1 caregiver, which is how these interactions are typically studied. And then in session B, we had those same individuals, but we asked other family members to join too, or household members. So this included things like a second parent, grandparent, nanny, siblings, and this varied depending on the child's family structure. And so I'm going to show you an example from the second session of an infant growing up in this in a Spanish-English bilingual household. This is session B with multiple caregivers. And as you watch, you'll hear some of these types of language switches that we're coding for. So we have within speaker switches, where one speaker speaks one language, and then that same speaker switches into another language. And across speaker switches, where one speaker speaks one language and a second speaker speaks a second language. So I'm going to go ahead and play this.
I thought it was now. We're hungry? Okay, Mama, ¿te trae comida? Can Mama bring you food?
That was the within
Okay.
speaker switch.
Mama's gonna get you food.
Espérate, voy a con Papa.
Come on, Ro.
And so that was an
Mama's
example of an
gonna be right
across
back.
speaker switch.
I thought it was now.
And I don't have time to go through all the results of this study, but I want to show you the individual data. And so in session A, where there's just one speaker, that's up here, here's Spanish, English, French, English. This bar on the left is the average across all of the dyads, and this is the average number of switches that that infant encountered per minute. So on average, they're encountering about 3 to 4 switches per minute. But here's the individual infant data, and you can see that while the average is 3 or 4, the infants are actually experiencing about 13 switches per minute, all the way up to down to 0 switches per minute. This is the same data for session B, now separated for within speaker and across speaker switches. And we see a similar pattern where the average isn't well representative of any individual infant's experience. And so when we collapse to an average, even if it's predictive, it really isn't capturing any individual infant's experience. And I think that's important to consider when we draw conclusions from research like this. And let me just wrap up quickly. So briefly, I'll mention some other efforts I've made to increase diversity. So Casey and I contracted with the Basara Center in Nairobi, Kenya, and anyone can do this. We had them collect videos of natural caregiver-infant interactions as a first step toward building a more culturally diverse corpus. Also, a group of researchers, many of whom are here in ManyBabies 5, have been designing a naturalistic version of the ManyBabies 5 study, in which we're looking at predictors of infants' preference for familiarity and novelty. And we hope that being part of the ManyBabies network will help us collect a diverse and large sample. And I'd love to talk about this some other time, but it's been a really interesting experience to think about how this controlled ManyBabies 5 study actually translates to everyday interactions, and it's definitely not straightforward. But just to wrap up, a few takeaways that I think you can make from this research is that most infant-directed communication is multidimensional. Infants' experience of speech and non-speech communication varies markedly across dyads. Context plays an important role in shaping the predictability of multidimensional input beyond just speech. And there's really no such thing as an average infant. A variation is not just noise, but likely a source of meaningful insight into development. And so to conclude, as I mentioned previously, I strongly believe that if we want to develop generalizable frameworks of early learning, we need to embrace and study the messy, dynamic, natural environments in which this learning actually occurs. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kosie. That was so interesting and amazing. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions, if anyone has any. Feel free to put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. No one has any questions. I actually have a question. So I was curious about, you have the sample size of 44, but it seems like this data could potentially be so noisy, as if what if the caregiver doesn't align like the webcam in the correct position, or you can easily code the behavior. Was there like lots of exclusions you had to do, or actually was it the case where a lot of the data was usable?
Yeah, a lot of the data was usable. And I think part of the reason for that is because we did send them these very clear images of like, this is what your setup should look like during the study. I mean, you can't get detailed information like you could in the lab, right? About like infants' gaze or things like that. That's going to be different. But I often, I was interested in particular in the caregiver here. And so in kind of requesting how they set up their camera, I kind of focused on the caregiver and putting the caregiver in the center. And I often told them, if the caregiver stays in the center, the infant will tend to come back. And so that was sort of my rationale for putting the caregiver in the center. And I think it's much harder to focus on the infant because they're the ones that move around the most. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. That's cool. All right, if nobody has any questions, then we can move on to Dr. Tess Forest from Columbia University.
Hello. Great. Okay, awesome. Assuming everything's good on screen sharing, I will go ahead and get started. Awesome. I'm getting a head nod from Candice. That's great. Cool. So yeah, my name's Tess. I'm a postdoc at Columbia where I work with primarily with Dima Amzo, and the project I'm going to tell you about today was done with a very large team of people from around the world. So lots of them are up on the screen, but we'll talk about that later too. So like Jessica, I'm really interested in the input that young learners are getting in naturalistic situations, but I'm going to pivot a little bit from talking about language and communication to asking more about how infants deal with the predictability of their early experiences and how that predictability might shape early attention and learning processes. So there are 3 big ideas I want to put out there that really shape my thinking about this. First, if we forget about caregivers just for a second, we know that attention and learning in early life are deeply entwined with the predictable structure of our world. Humans of all ages are really good at statistical learning or noticing, attending to, and learning about structured, predictable information. And so independent of caregivers, predictability is a really important signal for learning across life. Second, as we were sort of just starting to talk about, we know that caregivers actually differ in how predictable they are, and that might interact with early attention in really important ways, given that we know infants care a lot about predictable structure. And third, which is related to part 2, caregiver predictability has actually been linked to cognitive outcomes like memory and effortful control later in childhood, but we don't really have a great sense for why that is right now. So to me, it makes sense to ask whether the predictability of the signals that an infant is getting from their primary caregiver in early life are related to learning, both in the moment and longitudinally. And thinking about caregiver predictability as the input that a baby gets for learning in early life, I think allows us to ask a really broad set of questions about how, or at least whether, the structure of someone's early environment sets up the development of basic learning and memory systems in any particular way, or shapes how someone learns. In other words, the questions I'm going to be trying to talk about here today are, does a baby's early experience with environmental structure in the form of caregiver predictability shape anything about the way that they learn from their environment? So I'm going to tell you about 2 very related projects we've been doing recently to get at this bigger question. The first question that I'm going to ask is whether or not infants' experience with caregiver predictability shapes what they attend to in the moment. And then the second is whether or not caregiver predictability shapes the longitudinal development of statistical learning processes in the brain down the line. And all of the data that I'm going to tell you about today were collected as part of a study called KULA. So KULA is a large-scale longitudinal project that was designed to understand actually the emergence of executive function over the first 3 years of life in South Africa and in Malawi. So this is a non-Western sample, and in total there are about 500, mostly mother-infant dyads, who each came into the lab about 5 times between birth and when the babies turned 3. And as you can imagine, this is a really, really rich data set. There are MRI, parent-child interaction recordings, sleep data, microbiome data. I'm, of course, not going to talk about all of this today, but I'll just highlight the pieces of these data that we're using for each question as it becomes relevant. Okay. So let's get into it. Does infants' experience with caregiver predictability shape what they attend to? I think this is a really nice follow-up to Jessica's work, because we start to get at what the infant is doing in the moment in these sort of more messier naturalistic interactions. And the way that we asked this was using also recordings of infants playing with their caregivers. This is a video recorded in our lab in New York, but the setup was the same in the current sample. Here you'll see that the infant is in a car seat, which is really related to the question just at the end of the study here. So we are able to measure a little bit more what the infants are doing and what the caregivers are doing. And from these videos, we recorded, or sorry, I should note, in the particular study I'll tell you about now, there were about 250 dyads, and in this case, it was all moms. These videos were recorded when babies were about 4 months old in 2 within subject conditions. One, the caregivers had access to a basket of culturally relevant toys, and in the other one they didn't, so I'll call those the toy and the no toy condition. And from these videos, we extracted a measure of caregiver entropy, which I'll tell you about in just a second, and infant attention. So the way that we have been measuring caregiver predictability is by adapting a coding scheme that was developed by Alicia Davis and her colleagues, which measures the predictability of sensory behaviors. And it's relatively detailed, but I'm going to walk through a high-level version of how it goes. So on each frame of these videos, a team of very hardworking people, this is a theme in the webinar, I'm sure, hand annotates the presence or absence of 5 orthogonal caregiver behaviors. So those are whether or not the caregiver is vocalizing, holding an object, touching her baby, pointing, holding the baby. So as a quick example, let's say on the first frame of this video, the caregiver is vocalizing, but not doing anything else. And on the second frame, maybe she's vocalizing and holding an object, and so on and so forth for the rest of the video. And once we have this coded, we can transform this data frame into a sequence of states. So for example, the first state the caregiver is in is that she's vocalizing, and then she switches to a state which is vocalizing and holding an object, and then back to vocalizing, and so on and so forth. And you'll probably notice that this sequence of states does not include information about how long the caregiver is in each state, but it allows us to calculate the transitional probability or the likelihood of her moving from one state to any other. And this means we can calculate what's called her entropy. So entropy is a measure from information theory which reflects how unpredictable a source of information is. And in this case, caregiver entropy reflects how unpredictably a caregiver moves from one behavior to the next. And we can calculate this metric both overall across all of these behaviors and per behavior, which reflects how unpredictable a caregiver is after she vocalizes, for example. Okay, so that's our measure of caregiver unpredictability. And we also code whether or not the infant is looking at the caregiver on each frame of the video, which is what we're using as our measure of infant attention in this work. Okay, and before I tell you about what we found, I just want to make sure you know that there were a lot of people involved in coding these data, and we couldn't have done this work without them. So thank you to all of the people that helped us with this. And now we can look at what happened. So first, we were interested in understanding the structure of caregiver behavior across these two conditions, very relevant from Jessica's talk as well, because we thought it was possible that caregivers might be more or less predictable in different contexts. And so I'm going to plot the no toy condition in the lighter colors throughout the talk and the toy condition in darker colors. And the first thing we examined was whether caregivers' overall entropy, her predictability overall, differed across conditions. So we have condition on the x-axis and entropy on the y-axis. So remember, because entropy is a measure of unpredictability, less predictable values are higher. And what we found is that the overall entropy of caregiver behavior actually did not differ between conditions, suggesting that on average, caregivers are about equally structured. Next, we looked at whether or not this overall predictability metric was related in a between subjects way to how much a baby paid attention to or looked at their caregiver during the course of that entire interaction. So here I have overall entropy on the x-axis and total looking time in the 5-minute video in seconds on the y-axis. And what you can see is that in both of these conditions, we found that there was a significant negative correlation between caregiver entropy and looking time, suggesting that between dyads, infants seem to look less at less predictable caregivers. And this starts to suggest some sort of relationship between the predictable structure of caregivers' behavior and naturalistic infant looking in the moment. But I think we can get more detailed about really what's driving this infant looking signal. So the next thing we did was we looked at whether different sensory signals might be driving the structure of caregiver behaviors across conditions. Again, very similar to the type of questions Jessica was just telling us about. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to plot behavior-specific entropy, so how predictable was the caregiver after particular behaviors on the x-axis, and then, sorry, that's the y-axis, and then the behaviors on the x-axis. And the no toy condition will still be in the lighter colors, and the toy condition will be in the darker colors. And what you can see is that the entropy following vocalizing, so we're looking at the pink bars now, was higher in the no toy condition, but that the entropy following object holding was higher in the toy condition. And this means that caregiver behavior is actually differently structured across contexts, and the source of information that might be most useful for driving this infant looking signal might also differ across contexts. In other words, these different contexts lead to differently structured caregiver behavior, and if infants are sensitive to these variations in entropy across contexts, we might see that their attention is yoked specifically to one behavior's entropy over the other. Okay, I'll note also that the frequency of these behaviors does differ across contexts as well. I'm happy to chat about that, but the infant looking data that I'm going to show you are specifically yoked to the predictability of these behaviors and not the frequency. So what did we do? We asked whether infant looking was yoked to these context-specific differences in which behaviors were the highest entropy. And in particular, we were interested in the possibility that because higher entropy behaviors might provide more information that infants could use to learn from across time, the behaviors that had the highest entropy in each context might drive that looking relationship. So first, we looked at the correlation between infant looking on the y-axis and caregiver entropy following vocalizing on the x-axis. And these density plots are there to remind you that the entropy following vocalizing was higher in the no toy condition. That's the lighter density plot, it's hard to see, and lower in the toy condition. And what we saw is that the unpredictability of caregiver vocalizing was related to infant looking time specifically in the no toy condition, whereas unpredictability following caregiver object holding was related to infant looking time in the toy condition. And this suggests that infant attention overall was yoked to the predictability of the most informative or highest entropy sensory signal across contexts. Okay, so this is getting us closer to understanding whether infants are using differences in the structure of their caregiver's behavior to decide how they should be paying attention in the moment. But we can get even more detailed about this. And what I wanted to do next was understand whether infants were sensitive to temporal fluctuations in their own caregiver's entropy, and whether or not they might use this as a metric to decide when to attend to their caregiver versus when to look away. So to do this, we binned these whole dyadic interaction videos into 20-second windows, and then we computed caregiver entropy overall and infant looking within each window, within each 20-second chunk. And then I centered caregiver entropy within each caregiver. So now 0 on the x-axis reflects the average entropy for that caregiver, so someone's personal average, and higher values mean that that caregiver is being less predictable than she normally is, and lower values mean she's being more predictable than she normally is. And what we might expect to see if infants are sensitive to differences in their own caregiver's entropy across time is that they might have learned when it's useful for them to pay attention relative to their own caregiver's average. And indeed, this is what we found. There was a significant quadratic relationship between infants' caregivers' entropy across time within a caregiver and infant looking, such that in both conditions, although more strongly in the no toy condition, infants attended most to their caregiver when she was being sort of about as predictable as she normally is, or actually a little bit more predictable than normal. And this suggests that infants are using their own past experience to decide when it might be useful to attend to their caregiver based on moment-to-moment fluctuations in the predictability of her behavior. Okay, I'm really excited about these data because I think they suggest that there's an adaptive and learned relationship between infants' looking behavior and the entropy of their own past environment that shapes what they attend to across time. So, yes. And to quickly tell you about the second question, we wanted to now know whether that same caregiver predictability metric shaped the longitudinal development of these learning systems, which we know are involved in learning about the predictable structure of our world. And so in order to ask this, we use these same caregiver-child interaction videos that I just told you about when babies were 4 months old, and a subset of infants came back and did a statistical learning task during EEG when they were about 9 months old, so about 5 months down the line. And we use this to ask whether or not early life caregiver predictability might be related to a neural signature of statistical learning later in life. So I'm quickly going to walk you through how that task worked. For those of you that are familiar with statistical learning tasks, this will be rather standard. For those of you that might not be, the way these tasks typically work is that you present participants with repeating stimuli one at a time for a few minutes. In this case, babies heard a series of tones for about 7 minutes. And it turns out those tones were grouped into tone triplets. So every time you heard tone 7, the next tone you heard was tone 6, which was followed by tone 12. But that first tone triplet could be followed either by tone triplet 2 or tone triplet 3. And that means over the course of the learning phase, or this 7-minute exposure phase, participants could learn that some of these sounds were predictable while others were not. So for example, if you've learned the structure of these sequences, you know that after you've heard tone 6, you're going to hear tone 12, so it's predictable. Whereas you can't predict when you're going to hear tone 7, or it's harder to predict when you're going to hear tone 7 because it could happen after any other tone triplet. Okay, and then we actually used EEG recordings as an index of statistical learning by capitalizing on the fact that some of these tones are predictable while others are not. And for those of you that are not familiar with EEG data, what I'm plotting here is prior research, but it's electrical activity after the offset of a stimulus, in this case, the tone. And prior research has shown that 2 parts of this ERP wave differ as a function of whether the tone was predictable or not. So first, this negative deflection, which is called the N1, happens later for predictable tones than unpredictable tones. And this positive deflection, this which is called P2, happens to be higher, has a higher amplitude for predictable relative to unpredictable tones. So together with some collaborators at Northeastern, we asked whether or not the infants in our sample showed evidence of sort of differences in ERP responses that would indicate statistical learning before looking at whether or not caregiver predictability modulated that signal. And I'll just tell you that the N1 did not, so I'm just going to show you the data from the P2 amplitude here before moving on. Okay, so here I'm showing you P2 amplitude on the y-axis and tone position on the x-axis, ranging from unpredictable tones, which would be position 1, to predictable tones, which would be position 3. And I'm going to plot the data separately for the first half of the task and the second half of the task, since if there's a learning-related signature in these data, we would expect it to show up in the second half of the task. And what we found was a significant interaction between half of the task, age, and tone position, such that older babies in our sample showed a P2 response that seems to indicate statistical learning. So having seen some effective learning in this EEG signal, we next turn to understanding how it might be impacted by caregiver predictability earlier in life. And specifically, we used an EEG index of learning, which reflects the difference in ERP responses or P2 responses to the predictable minus the unpredictable tones. And we related this to caregivers' entropy following vocalizing at 4 months to see if the most relevant sensory signals predictability might relate to this learning score later in life. And lo and behold, we found that there was a negative relationship such that the less predictable, right, this is entropy, so further values on the x-axis means one's less predictable caregivers had babies who showed less of a difference between the ERP responses to the predictable and the unpredictable tones. In other words, infants with lower entropy caregivers showed a larger difference to the predictable and unpredictable tones, suggesting potentially differences in how the brain responds to new predictable structure as a function of earlier life caregiver predictability. Okay, so to wrap up, infants attend to their own caregiver most when she's most predictable relative to herself, and there are longitudinal effects of experience with regular predictable input on basic learning processes, suggesting that environmental structure early in life shapes how infants learn both in the moment and down the line. And these findings, so infants attend to their caregiver most when she's useful relative to herself, and there are longitudinal effects of experience with regular predictability on these basic learning processes. And these findings provide a framework by which the predictability of caregiver behavior might shape the fundamental sort of early optimization of attention for learning in infancy and later cognitive development. So yeah, I'd be happy to take your questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting.
Great, yeah.
Anybody have any questions? Feel free to put it in the chat or just unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when in your first research question where you were presenting the results for the predictability after vocalization,
Yeah.
what period of time were you using for after the vocalization?
Yeah, good question. So the way that these calculations work is that you are interested over the whole course of the video, for example, in how likely it is that you get, let's say, touching the baby after vocalizing or pointing after vocalizing. And so you calculate the total transitional probability or the likelihood that over this whole video, given all the behaviors you've seen from the mom, how likely is it that after she vocalizes, she's going to do some next thing? And so it's about what happens next, not what happens in the 5 seconds after she vocalizes or 10 seconds after she vocalizes, which is also a really great question. But in our case, it's it's a value which reflects, given all the behaviors that did happen, what was the likelihood that it was X, Y, or Z? And so when we're doing it per behavior, we just restrict the analysis to only include states which are vocalizing or which include vocalizing, depending on the question at hand. And then we look at the likelihood, the predictability of what happens after that state.
Amazing. We have some questions in the chat, but we're going to save those for the end, and we're going to move on to Dr. Zuzanna Laudańska from Heidelberg University.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Zuzanna Laudańska. I'm a postdoc at Heidelberg University and at the Institute of Psychology of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, Poland. And as Jessica and Tess, I'm also very much interested in the role of context in early development. And however, I'm also very much interested in the multimodality of those behaviors and how to combine the research of multimodal behaviors in different contexts. And during my today's presentation, I will also put a little bit more emphasis on some of the technical solutions and the technical setup that we've created to kind of run those multimodal interactions. But before that, I would like to say a huge thank you to and show you the teams behind those data. As we all know that the longitudinal data collection, manual annotation of behaviors are highly time intensive. So both teams in Warsaw and Heidelberg contributed to that work. And if we think about infancy, and infants can be thought of as complex dynamic systems. And development can be understood as multi-directional interactions across all the levels of the developing system. And these interactions unfold over many different timescales, from millisecond to millisecond, over the scale of years to years, basically. And complex systems tend to change their states dynamically, often showing very unpredictable long-term behaviors. So if you think of 4 months old and then we look at them in 27 months of age, it's like a huge difference in how babies express their actions and behaviors. Importantly, behaviors of complex systems are also very much context dependent. And I would like to highlight a recent kind of opinion or perspective paper from Hannah and Dean Souza, who elaborated a little bit more on the theories behind all those different concepts. And they are highlighting the importance of studying the consistency of behaviors across different situations. Importantly, screen-based paradigms, experimenter-led tasks, lab-based studies, or standardized tests all offer very valuable insights, but only within the context, a very specific context, unless demonstrated otherwise. So we are used to, as researchers, to consider kind of structured interactions with either experimenters or even parents in like a tabletop design or a very restricted body positions as kind of already a step toward naturalistic setup in comparison to screen-based experiments. However, those highly structured environments offer very limited degrees of freedom, and they allow us to better kind of understand a very specific task at hand, but not really how it generalizes to all different types of behaviors. Today, I will be mostly focusing on the in-between stage, so kind of making a step forward to make the situation a bit more naturalistic by putting no constraints on body position of either baby or the caregiver during the naturalistic free-flowing social interactions. So that leads to a less structured field of view of the baby because they are not restricted in a seated position face-to-face to the caregiver. However, that still keeps some level of similarity across dyads because we have the same room, the same lighting conditions, limited number of objects, and kind of restricting only to the context of play during parent-child interactions and not capturing all the other activities as walks or meal times and so on and so forth. And we already seen some examples from Jessica already today on how kind of way more complex real life can look like. So kind of I'm acknowledging that I'll be kind of operating on the semi-standardized, semi-structured free-flowing interactions. And I'll be showing a few examples that were conducted in Germany and Poland. However, I'll be mostly focusing on the setups in Poland because there we study babies from 4 months onwards. And we already have some preliminary results on the multimodal interactions, as well as we're like a new data incoming that also includes eye tracking, head-mounted eye tracking interactions that I will show you some examples later on. If you're interested in the research in the first 4 months of age, that's what we specialize here in Heidelberg right now. You can have a look at our recent papers that were predominantly focused on the motor behavior. However, we are also working on making this data set multimodal and analyzing the vocal and visual parts of it. That's coming soon. So now let's focus on the Warsaw part where I will be starting with the Move-In project. That was a longitudinal study when we were inviting infant and caregiver dyads 5 times to the lab when babies were at 4, 6, 9, and 12 months of age, and then a follow-up visit at 27 months of age. And we recruited 104 dyads who participated across those 5 visits. And we were recording their limb movements using motion trackers. And we put motion trackers on both babies and caregivers. And here you have the little circles indicate the positioning of those motion trackers. And we also put some head cameras kind of to get the estimate. Not as good as the head-mounted eye tracking, just a spoiler, but it's still kind of a nice step to collect this naturalistic first-person perspective videos. However, they were also recorded with the lab cameras and a very sensitive lab microphone that allowed us to analyze their vocal production. And that would be the first example of results that I'll be showing you. We looked into how the context of play shapes early proto-conversations. And in this, we focused on 3 different types of play that vary with their number of degrees of freedom that they offer and kind of the emphasis on which modality is kind of more leading. So during book sharing, obviously, it's a way more verbal task with that enhances the proto-conversations and elicits caregiver input. Then we have, as we call it, manipulative toys, which can be squeezed, touched, they make some different noises and so on. And then finally, a way more rhythmic context of rattle shaking activity. There were no further instructions to the caregivers. They were just offered a set of toys, and they could position themselves as they wish throughout the entire recording. Each task lasted around 5 minutes. And then we coded their vocalizations of the babies, as well as all the utterances, all the speech utterances of the caregivers. And we calculated the number of conversational turns extracted from those coded files. If you are interested in the alternatives to the manual annotations, recently with colleagues from the European Cost Action coordinated by Sam Walls, we put together a review paper on kind of where we are as a field and what's available for different languages as well, and limited use in clinical populations. So you can have a look at the paper in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. But kind of coming back to the Warsaw study, we showed that infant vocalizations become context dependent at 12 months of age. So not earlier, not at 4, 6, and 9 months, we have not observed any differences in their volubility, so of rate per minute of their vocalizations. However, at 12 months, they were vocalizing less during the play with manipulative toys, but almost equally the same in book sharing and rattle shaking. So both this kind of book sharing context and the very rhythmic musical interaction styles were eliciting a high number of infant vocalization at 12 months of age. Parents were very constant. So they were consistently talking more to their babies during book sharing than during 2 other tasks. And that was already present at 4 months of age and remained consistent across all 4 time points. The interesting effect was observed at the dyadic level. So in here, we found out that the number of conversational turns that in that measure, the differences emerged earlier, already at 9 months, than to when we only looked at infant vocalization. So really, it seems that this combination of the dyadic activity and the role of context was definitely kind of at the interplay. And infants were, the rate of conversational turns was higher during book sharing already at 9 months of age in comparison to other tasks. We also found out that infants' latency to respond to parents' speech was longer during book sharing. And we are kind of thinking of it as a potential way that if they are slowing down, that there is a possibility to get this more dialogue-like structure. So that could be a potential mechanism how book sharing supports the development of this dialogic structure. And now let's move to another modality. And I would like to show a quick example from the same cohort when we zoom into a very particular type of movement, specifically the rattle shaking. So we annotated from videos all the instances where infants were attempting to rattle. So that could be, at 4 months, it's not really great, but it gets definitely way better, way more exciting at 12 months. However, we annotated all those episodes, and then using the given the synchronization between the signals, we then looked into the motion tracking data in those specific moments when they were rattling the rattle. And we found out that across the first year of life, infants were making more rattling movements and at higher frequency. So that's already an interesting finding, kind of looking at how the specific context of rattle shaking activity is also visible at the very meticulous level of their movements and very precise measurement of their movement. Then we looked into how the coordination between left and right arm of the baby changes across the first year of life during this specific activity. For this, we used the wavelet coherence, which is a method used to analyze how two signals are related to each other over time and across different frequencies. And it allows us to see when and at what frequencies the left and right arm movements are kind of synchronized and happening in parallel. And again, we found that wavelet coherence increased with age, and it was higher at 12 months than at 4 or 6 months. Another example that we looked into in the same cohort again is the multimodal interactions. So kind of how within infant, how the movements and vocalizations are happening. So the intertwinement of motor and vocal development in infancy. And we found out that vocalizations are coupled with limb movements across all 4 time points. So there was a clearer activation of limb movements, like a higher activation around the onset of each of their vocalization in comparison to a baseline level of no vocalizations. However, this is slightly changing across the time points, because at the first time point, it was almost the same for arms and legs. Then it was slightly higher for legs. And at 9 and 12 months, the co-activation of arms was higher than the co-activation of legs. So that's an interesting effect that we are potentially thinking of a way of one of the mechanisms supporting the speech gesture system development and this kind of clearer co-activation of the arm movements with the vocal production. And this paper was accepted today, so you can see it out in the public very soon. And I'd like to very briefly move to another project, and this is actually still work in progress. However, we are at the very final stretch of the longitudinal data collection with over 60 families already involved in the project. So I thought it's kind of useful to showcase a few of the methods how we are that we are applying in that project. And in here, we again are focusing on the motor and vocal intertwinement, however, also adding the visual modality to this. And in here, we are following the dynamic systems and like the developmental cascades perspective, studying into how all those different modalities are changing when the infants are in the process of independent sitting acquisition. So we invite them 3 or 4 times to the lab, depending on like how fast they are with the progression of the motor skills. In the longitudinal design, so we have them first as non-sitters, then at near sitters and wobbly sitters and expert sitters when they can confidently be left alone in the seated position. And importantly, this is a milestones-based design, so we will control for their age, but that's not the main focus on kind of scheduling the next appointments. And there are 3 objectives. The first one is to investigate how the transition to independent sitting affects infants' attention to faces and toys during free play. So that's the naturalistic part. Then we also wanted to kind of bridge a little bit the screen-based research with the naturalistic research. And in the same cohort, at each visit, we are also asking them to watch a typical free viewing paradigm in front of the screen-based eye tracker, to have a very precise measure of how they are looking at specifically the articulating mouth of the faces of the screen. And third, we are also looking at how the transition to independent sitting affects infant vocalization. So kind of bridging this attention to the articulating mouth with the vocal production. And why do we think it matters generally? Here you have a quick example from the eye tracking, screen-based eye tracking, not screen-based, sorry, the head-mounted eye tracking, which is a Pupil Labs Neon. And here you have the change of the field of view thanks to sitting. Baby's on the back, and now mother helps to position them to the independent sitting. And you can see from mostly the ceiling, now there's like way easier access to faces and toys. That's the recording from the pilot study. That's why we have like a dyadic interaction with the father as well. But generally for the project, we have them just as a infant caregiver dyads. Here I have a sneak peek how babies are dressed up for that project. So they are a little ninjas with all the motion trackers on them, as well as the head-mounted eye tracking. And also what is very useful for running this type of data collection, it's we have amazing experience with feedbacking to parents. They are really interested to see their baby's first-person perspective That's an amazing also tool for staying in touch with them, sending them some clips, and basically maintaining the contact with the families during the longitudinal study. And this is what I kind of strategically showcased, that we also wanted to keep this full spectrum of different types of contexts in which we can study infant development, from the very standardized screen-based and bridging it to a fully naturalistic attention to faces during free play. And that's a collaboration with Dr. Joan Birules from Barcelona, and we'll be looking kind of at the same babies in those two conditions, so kind of faces on screens versus faces in real life. And one thing I wanted to highlight for the free-flowing naturalistic interactions in our lab is that when we do not study the tabletop play, or we don't seed babies already for all the experiments, we get way more interesting visual angles. So here you have some examples of the variability of the body positions that they are in during the session. Importantly, the eye tracker is quite well tolerated in all of them, so that's an important technical solution for that as well. And here you have some examples of the visual angles that we see in the head-mounted eye tracking recordings when they are on their back. So we have very interesting ceiling in the lab, and our lamps are fascinating for the babies. And you can see the caregivers need to really intentionally lean over the baby to be present in their field of view. So that's kind of one important thing to acknowledge. And also, when the babies are playing with objects very close to their face, this is what you see on the final photo here. It's like a really close up to the toy when they are like manipulating it right in front of their face. In a prone position, we have a lot of floor, so that's also the dominant kind of feature of their visual field of view. They can see either their own hands, as you can see in the first photo, or the caregiver's hands, but it's not that easy to have both of them at the same time. Not even mentioning the caregiver face, which is usually outside of their field of view in this body position. The caregiver really needs to lie in a prone position as well to be kind of face to face with their baby. And finally, in the seating position, that's where there's way more possibility for more complex visual scenes to analyze. So they could be sharing the same field of view with the caregiver. They can see the entire presence of the caregiver or the experimenter, and also kind of have multiple different toys at the same time in their field of view. Here you have a cute example of the wobbly sitter. So that was actually the first time when the baby remained seated when left alone, and that happened during our testing session. So you can see also the important role of the caregiver in positioning of the child. So really making sure the child does not fall down. And that role of caregiver is also one of our secondary plans for the data analysis, to look into how they are structuring this stability of the body positions, and what role does it play for both the motor and vocal behaviors of the infant. It's also important for the dyadic interactions, such as the communication visually, because here you have the child in the seated position. It was very easy for that child to redirect the attention from the caregiver face to the toy and back. So that's also kind of one of the technical solutions, how we can get a bit more precise data on this kind of dyadic visual interactions, and also on the multimodal perspective. So I hope I showcased a few different solutions that can be upscaled later on to a more to home recordings and to capturing even broader repertoire of the infant multimodal behaviors across different time points. So thank you very much for the attention.
Amazing talk. I know I definitely have questions, but we're first going to move on to the last talk and have lots of questions at the end, just so that we have time for our final talk. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Peter Krøjgaard from Aarhus University. I hope I pronounced the university name correctly. Sorry if I didn't.
It's fine. Thank you. Can you see? Can you see the screen?
We see your presenter view.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for organizing this webinar. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. So thank you.
Sorry,
Now,
Peter.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We see your presenter view, so we see like a subset of the slide along with like your notes.
How Okay, how can what should I do to avoid this?
Maybe try to reshare.
Yeah. Sorry.
And if you could just try to angle your mic a little bit closer to your mouth, I think that would also help the audio.
Can you see it now?
I just see your desktop and I see the presenter view again, but if you can't get it to show just a slide, that's okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have no idea what to do to avoid this. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Can you see? Okay. Thanks a lot for having me here. I'm very pleased and honored to be part. I'm a professor from Monash University, and I've done experimental studies all my life, so this is actually atypical for me. So please bear with me. Now, the study I'll be showing about government studies has been conducted with these collaborators, and without the contributions of these people, I wouldn't be able to have this talk. So thanks to these people. So the outline of my talk is in 3 steps. First, I have to do some background on spontaneous recall, and then I'll talk about the method I was talking about, the dyadic method as such, and finally I'll go through some pros and cons and recommendations with regards to the dyadic method. Now, so it's a bit of background. So I'm into examining episodic memory in young children, and the predominant method by far is simply to ask kids directly, typically in the form of, tell me everything you can remember about X. Now, for us adults, this is simple. This is a simple task. We can easily search in our memories and respond, but it actually is a 2-step sequence. So first you have to search for the memory, and then you respond. This is simple for adults, but it's actually not very simple for children. So basically, we've got 2 different modes of retrieval. The first one on the left side here, strategic recall, is the one I've just talked about. Typically, you get a question asked, and then you respond to it. Could be, please tell me everything you remember about the trip to the forest. And the audience here says, well, we thought this who's going. However, an alternative to this that is much less examined is spontaneous recall, where we are not asked any questions, but maybe this girl is watching, is seeing a spruce cone, and she is reminded by a simple association that she was actually in the forest this day and were collecting spruce cones. And we are very interested in spontaneous recollection because they are more simple and maybe easier for young children. So the 2 versions of retrieval have some similarities. They are both conscious. They are assumed to rely on the same long-term memories, but the mechanisms of retrieval are assumed to be different. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but what the overall strategic retrieval, it's voluntary, it's deliberate, it's top-down, it's often initiated by questions, it involves prefrontal cortex, and it's cognitively demanding. On the other hand, spontaneous research or retrieval is associative, bottom-up, typically triggered by distinct cues, it can be optics, places, people, or something said, and it does not involve prefrontal cortex, so it's less cognitively demanding. So, and it's probably also an earlier developmental retrieval. Now, we've defined those spontaneous memories as verbally produced, environmentally cued, and unprompted, which means they are not a result of any questions asked. Now, quite recently, there's been an accumulation of a lot of studies trying to examine spontaneous recollection using experimental designs. And some of these experiments come from our lab with normals. And most of these studies have used the basic same design, and you can watch this review from 2022 if you're more interested in this. Just very briefly, the experiment is about having the kids shown a stage event in a lab, and we bring them back 1 week later and see whether they spontaneously talk about the event they saw 1 week earlier. Now, so this experimental design and simple designs has allowed for a lot of systematic manipulations of cues, age groups, retention intervals, and so forth. But as we've seen several examples of today, experiments also have limitations. So the testing, the available cues, and therefore the potential spontaneous recollections we examined were somewhat constrained in advance by the researchers, that is us. And further, and maybe even more important, social interaction as potential cues, they were simply ruled out by design because we asked our parents in these experiments to not say anything while the experiments went on. So social interaction is simply not present in the experimental studies. Now, a diary study might address these limitations. So now we enter what I'm actually going to talk about, that is the diary study and the diary method. So at times it's called experience sampling method. And we use an adapted version of this method that actually was originally devised for adults by my colleague, Laudańska. We have used it for 2.5 to 5-year-olds, and we've used it in 2 studies. The ones I'll be talking mostly about is the first one, where we tested 51 3-year-olds. We've also, it's not published, it's in preparation, we've compared 3 and 5-year-olds, and then we also have just submitted a double case study with 1 2.5-year-old and 1 4.5-year-old. So in order to prepare for the diary method, it actually involves very careful face-to-face instruction to the parent. So first we have to tell the parents what are spontaneous recollections, just as I've told you. We give them very specific examples and examples of what it is not. And then obviously you have to decide for a data collection period. And in the study I'll be talking about today, we asked the parents to collect up to 2 spontaneous memories per day across a 2-week period. And in one of the follow-up studies, we have sort of condensed that to 4 spontaneous memories, up to 4 spontaneous memories across just 4 consecutive days, typically weekends. And in the case study, I also mentioned the parents collected up to 10 spontaneous memories for each 2-week period. That was 2 weeks per month across 7 months, so it's a completely different ballgame. Now, what do parents actually report? Well, the reporting sequence is a 2-step procedure. First, they report by a notebook you see on the left, and I'll actually got down here in my hands, but you can see it's very small. And then later, it's the same evening, they fill out an online questionnaire. So why a 2-step procedure? Well, we reasoned that it might be easier for parents to give a rough and dirty write down on what the child said immediately in the notebook, and then make a more comprehensive response later the same evening. And it actually works. So the notebook, as I've just shown you, is very small, and parents are asked to keep this in a pocket during the data collection, be it 4 days or maybe 2 weeks. And it's small, if you've just seen. And it serves as a reminder for the more comprehensive online questionnaire much later. So in the notebook, they report date and time, where the memory occurred, the child's mood on a Richter scale from 1 to 5, the child's utterance should be written down verbatim, number of words used, and then what they thought was the triggering cue. Was it an object, location, or something set, or something different? And then the event, the child was reminded, with the balance of the remembered event, again on a Richter scale from 1 to 5. Now, then The data analysis is exclusively based on the online questionnaire they fill out later the same day. And every evening, then the parent receives a text reminder to fill out the questionnaire, and they simply get a message: has the child had any spontaneous memories today? And if they respond no, then the browser closes down. And if they respond yes, they're automatically linked to the questionnaire, which is timestamped, so we can actually see where they actually fill out the questionnaire on the same day where they report their memory. It's much more detailed, but based on some of the keywords from the notebook. So they should now fill out, based on their what they've written down in the notebook, what cues might have triggered the memory, and they are supposed to pick on a predetermined list. If they can pick more than one. They also asked a bunch of questions. Are you certain that your child has actually experienced the event reported? And only affirmative responses are actually moved on to the data analysis as such. Otherwise, it's experience. How old is the memory? They're supposed to report how much time has passed since the memory event took place. And has the child previously talked about the event? Has it been heard? Again, from a Likert scale from 1 to 5. And do you consider the remembered event to be an important or unimportant experience in the child's life? Again, on a Likert scale. And then just basically about the number of hours spent with the child that day. Now, how do we code the data? As already mentioned, all the data, they are exclusively based on the online questionnaire. And all the reported memories, they were assessed for whether they were genuine, spontaneous recollections. For instance, preferences were excluded if the child states, I like watching Peggy the Pig. It's just a repeated statement. It could be a memory, but it's excluded in this case. And there are a lot of other exclusions as well. And 20% of all reported spontaneous recollections, they were rescored for assessing inter-rater agreement, and 12.5% of the reported memories by the parents were actually excluded. So that is very important that you inform the parents very meticulously in order to have a clear idea about what a spontaneous recollection is. So we have a dropout. Some of the reported memories are simply moved out of the data analysis and they do not conform to the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now, as I just mentioned, it was started by Laudańska from 2023 to collect spontaneous recollections in 24 to 36 months old, as registered by the parents across a 2-week period. So these collections actually show many of the same sort of phenomenological characteristics, as well as a forgetting curve, resembling what we should expect in parents. So they forget just like adults do, just steeper. And second, and at least as important, whereas it was confirmed that environmental cues trigger spontaneous recollections, as they do and also in our experience, then actually almost a third of the recollections were triggered by something said. It cannot be a question, but it can be something that the parent states, like, just like the example I'll tell you later on. So as you see down here, something said, which is a social cue, was actually the second most prominent cue. You would never find this in the experiments, but because in the experiments, the parents that are asked to be silent. So just to give you an example, when buying groceries together with the 3-year-old son, the mother asked him to get a carrot in the supermarket. And in this case, the child smiled, grasped a carrot, and then enthusiastically replied, are we going to the deer park again to feed the deer? Because 2 weeks earlier, they had actually visited the deer park for the first time in order to feed the deers with carrots. So this is an example. Had it been a question from the parent, then it wouldn't have been a spontaneous recollection, but it was not. The child was obviously probably reminded by the carrot. So these something said is a very prominent cue in the diary study, and we never find it in the experiments. So it appears to be important in children's everyday lives. And in this way, the results from our experiments on the one hand and the diary studies on the other, they actually complement each other. So we get a much more firm understanding on spontaneous recollection when we use both methods. And there actually another advantage for using diary studies for spontaneous recollections, and might be interesting in other aspects as well. Because the basic problem when examining children's subsequent recollections of states events is that encoding is only rarely ensured. The majority, by far, I would assume, maybe 95% of all research on event memory in kids is that you show them some event or ask them about an event, but you actually do not ensure that it's actually encoded. So failure to recall could actually either be due to forgetting or to lack of encoding. We typically do not know. However, in this case, we could exploit the recent participation because we knew that they had had these spontaneous recollections. So we knew that the children actually had an encoded memory. So we exploited this by bringing the kids back to the lab and asked them about the memories they had spontaneously talked about recently. So over a 2-week period, we took the last 3 events that they had spontaneously talked about, and we asked them about these events in the lab, and it was within a week after the diary study had studied. And here are, these are 3-year-olds, and they had a very difficult time responding to these questions about memories we knew they'd just been talking about. So actually, if you see the bottom line here, more than half of the children simply cannot say anything about the memories they have just actually talked about. Let's say something about how difficult strategic retrieval, where they have to search for the memories and talk about the memories, is for young kids. And we actually scored it very liberally, because if they just said, do you remember about when you were feeding feeding carrots to the deers? If the child just says yes, they'll get a tick. So it was very liberal coding. But nevertheless, more than half of the children couldn't say anything about the memories we knew for certain they had encoded and actually talked about. So we've had, I just mentioned, we have got 2 more studies in the pipeline, a follow-up study with 3 and 5-year-olds, and then this double case study with 2 of my colleagues, their young daughters, but with a much more dense data collection. So, pros and cons and recommendations. Now, it allows for assessing spontaneous recollections in children's everyday lives and from the child's perspective. So sometimes we don't know whether what we show them in the lab is actually interesting for the kids, but the things they say spontaneously in the real world is probably interesting for the kids. It also allows for assessing of social cues, which is simply not possible, at least not in the experimental setup we've been running for years. And it paves the way also for post-hoc examining of memories. We know for certain that has been encoded and consolidated, and that's actually rare when examining event memory in young kids. There are obviously some cons. It's highly dependent on the parents' compliance to instructions. So how you actually instruct parents and the time and effort you do to do that is very important in order to get valid information from the parents. So post-hoc validation of the reported materials is completely necessary. We have to rescore it and validate it. And also, we also experienced with some journals, they're actually skeptical towards style and methodology in general. So some are difficult to convince that this is actually interesting, but ultimately we typically succeed. So recommendations is to carefully make instructions to parents to increase the probability of eligible reports by the parents. And we would also suggest that we restrict the diary period or dense periods. That is, it simply works better with 4 days across a weekend than 2 weeks and up to 2 memories across 2 weeks. And text reminders to parents are crucial, otherwise they might forget about the reports. And we've used this notebook and it actually works, but as the world gets more technical, we might consider using an app version of the notebook in the future. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right, so we had a lot of super interesting talks today. Does anybody have any questions off the top of their head if they want to unmute? If not, we can start going through the questions in the chat. Sorry, so it looks like maybe we should take one of the questions in the chat. So I think this question goes back to Tess's talk. So the question is, are there any data on predictability in adult interactions? So are people more predictable with infants than with each other?
That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. My guess is that a thing we have been thinking a lot about is how the predictability of caregiver behavior and how it's structured differently over time likely changes across early life. So the videos I showed you were from 4-month-old babies who are in a car seat, right? They're pretty passive audience relative to like some of the other talks that we heard about, even just a couple months down the line. And it's quite likely there's a lot of really interesting work, especially in toddlerhood, trying to understand the structure of dyadic interactions between kids and their caregivers that show that across early life, you start to get more more aspects of those interactions which are led by the kid versus by the caregiver. And there's a lot of cool work going on about how different actors in the interactions might shape those behaviors. And so my sense about adults is that it's much, of course, caregivers and their babies are working together on these interactions, but my sense is in adults, you have 2 or 3 or 4, however many people are in the interaction, working more collectively to sort of operate under social norms, conversational norms that they both expect, rather than like a caregiver leading a highly predictable or less predictable interaction or responding to their kid in early life. So my guess is it's a little bit more parallel or even between the two actors, but there's a lot of work to be done on understanding that.
Cool. We also have another question asking if there is like a course that you took on how to code or calculate entropy, but I'm guessing that this is a method that was kind of invented within your lab. Am I correct?
Not in our lab. So the method that we're using was initially started by a group with Alicia Davis's lab, and it was actually done in rodents and in kids, and we've taken it and sort of adapted it a bit for our lab. But yeah, the coding is done by hand using data view as a software, and you could adapt any number of coding schemes to work in your own lab. I will note that our group, along with some computer vision people, are working on a machine learning analysis that automates these entropy calculations, which I'm really excited about. The paper's under review, so you can hopefully use them soon. But yeah, there wasn't a course that we took to make it happen.
Cool.
I want to jump in real quick on that question. I just want to ask for you and any of the other presenters here, if you have any resources that actually might help people who might be interested in adopting one of these methods, if you share them with us, and we can find a way to share them out with the community as well. So whether that be, papers that you might have in on the way, or papers that help shape your understanding of the things that you were, how you coded and what you coded, would be really helpful.
100%. That would be awesome. So I think I've got one more question for Tess from the chat. So the question is, I was wondering about cases where caregivers produce only few behaviors, but in a highly predictable pattern. For example, when they just label and point to a few objects in sequence, do you include any control variable or threshold for caregiver behavior frequency when calculating the entropy data?
Yes, the short answer is yes. We account for the frequency of these behaviors in our analyses, which looked at how entropy is related to infant attention. We don't exclude caregivers who have really predictable behaviors, because that's also interesting to us. And you're absolutely right that if you only have, like if you switch between vocalizing and touching the baby back and forth, you're likely to get highly predictable behavior. We don't include people for not switching a lot, but we do account for the frequency of behaviors in our analyses.
Awesome. So our next question is for Zuzanna. So just wondering if you ever included a habituation familiarization phase for infants and caregivers to get accustomed to wearing the sensors or eye tracking glasses. They're interested because one example heard from colleagues is that the eye trackers can be very distracting for babies, especially in terms of infants staring only at eye tracker worn by caregivers while interacting with them. That's a good question.
Yeah, this is an amazing question. Very important points. We try to mitigate it in several ways. So first of all, we do have a kind of warm-up period that's not recorded, but as we are dressing up the baby slowly and we are explaining the entire procedure to the caregivers, so there is this time of kind of familiarization with the room and familiarization with all the equipment. That's kind of the first part. Second, we also add one kind of free play session to both the projects where they are not wearing any motion trackers or eye trackers. So it's kind of a control task that we have this data for follow-up analysis to kind of really see either applying computer vision or kind of manual annotation or vocalization to have this kind of a baseline in a way to control for the effect of all the equipment on them. And third, for the eye tracking project, so that the point that babies are very distracted by what caregivers are wearing, and sometimes it's more distracting for them to look at the caregiver in the equipment than be bothered by what they are wearing. We observed this for the head cameras, and that was one of the reasons why we decided not to record the eye tracking dyadically, because the Pupil Labs eye trackers now, they are available also like that, they just look like glasses. So that could be way more familiar for them. But for now, we are only focusing on the infant field of view across the transition to sitting. So that's one of the kind of limitations and like trade-offs of each design. But for these reasons, babies are not that much interested in the caregiver face. Motion trackers are usually under the clothes. Those are like black bands. They are not as interesting for them, and that's kind of less destructive. So there's nothing on the caregiver's face for the head-mounted eye tracking study.
Awesome. So we have one more minute. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself for any of the speakers.
I had a question if nobody else does, but I can also talk to these people all offline. But but I was wondering, in the last talk, Peter, if you have a sense for whether or not we might be undercounting the likelihood of spontaneous recall in kids, given that asking grown-ups to be sure that the kid actually has that memory means we're relying on grown-ups having the memory of the same event and having a similar memory to what kids would have. So we know kids remember super weird and different stuff about their experiences. And so if you're a kid and you remember some random aspect of the park that you went to and your parent forgot about that aspect of the park, and then you bring it up later, the parent might not register that as part of your memory. And I wonder how you think about that when you're thinking about these naturalistic spontaneous recalls.
I think it's a very good question. And I think that I'm quite sure that we underestimate the amount of spontaneous recollections for several reasons. One is that we only capture what they state out loudly. I mean, I have a lot of spontaneous recollections, but most of them are boring and I don't state them out loud. and as the children get older, they might feel exactly the same. So we only catch what they actually state. That is one clear limitation. So there might be a lot of memories they actually think but do not state. And so until they get older, we cannot ask them a question about, did you involuntarily report that memory, or was it also exception to recall? They won't get it until they're older. And also another reason is that when we do it, at least in the lab, it's clearly underestimated because we have a situation where the kids, the parents are asked not to say anything. So we have a very silent sort of setting. So some of the kids are whispering because they get the impression they shouldn't state anything. So I'm pretty certain that we sort of downturn the element. In the dialogue, it's actually a better sequence because in that respect, because then they're just on their own.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to the speakers. That was so amazing and super interesting. And thank you to the audience. And can anyone reach out to you guys with any further questions via email? Awesome. Okay, great. Well, have a great rest of your Monday, everybody.